We'll give the attendees who are waiting a couple minutes to get in.
Should I start?
Yeah,
And like,
feel that you're on table.
it feels like, here, you wanna write on it?
All right. Why don't we get started? As most everybody here in the room knows me, Eamon Wilde. Work in the English department and also here at UMSL Global. And I want to give a special thank you to my colleague in UMSL Global, Bob L., who has set up all of this for today. All the different parts that made this performance possible, he's been involved in. And also Jackie, who's there at the door. Jackie helped us put the table, put all the tables and chairs together this morning. And also our executive director, Leanna Constantine, who makes all kinds of things possible too. She's not here today because she's out sick. She's out sick. But a great welcome to everybody here. A particular welcome to the English 3090 students that are involved in the class with me this semester. We're currently reading Oscar Wilde, so it's really interesting to have this bring everybody together today. And also, there's a lot of people here from some people here from UMSL Global, some people are here from the St. Louis community, and so we're thrilled that everybody is here. This is the first event we have had in this room, live event, since March 2020. And in March 2020, thanks. In March 2020, we just thought everything would just continue as before, and then of course the pandemic happened. And we did these programmings for the last 2 years as webinars. Today now we're doing the program live, but it's also a webinar. So we have an audience here, and we have an even larger audience who are following the talk today on webinar. And as I said a few minutes ago, soon, or as we go along, we're all going to be immortalized now because it'll be up on YouTube, right? And we can look at it and we can say to ourselves, I'm such a good-looking person. Look, and I can go back and look at ourselves over and over again. So a great welcome to everybody. We have 2 more events this semester. On October 13th, Marty Fahey and Liz Carroll will be here to play Irish music and also to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Irish Free State with the treaty. And then our last event of the semester will be on November 8th, and that will be a webinar on Zoom, and that will be with Andrea Malcolm, who is the executive director of the Molly Brown Museum in Denver. And she will be talking about Molly Brown, the famous Irish American survivor of the Titanic, and who was involved in a lot of things in the American West. And so there are things that are coming up. Our program today ends at 1:45. Michael Gillespie will speak for 45 minutes, and then we will have time for questions and answers. All right. So today we're thrilled and honored to welcome Michael Patrick Gillespie to UMSL Global and to our campus. Professor Gillespie teaches at Florida International University and is one of the most distinguished scholars working in contemporary literary studies. He works on Irish literature, modern literature, postmodern literature, and more, including film. Through the years, he has won many prestigious awards for his work, including the Charles Fanning Medal for Distinguished Work in Irish Studies. And we are very honored to have Charles Fanning sitting back there. So another very distinguished person. So Michael received the Charles Fanning Award. And Charles is here today to hear Michael speak, not to ask for the medal back or anything like that. So we're very happy to have these wonderful people here today. Michael has also served his discipline by taking leadership positions in many academic organizations. He has achieved so much that I often wonder if there are actually 2 or 3 Michael Gillespies. Most important, his work is widely admired by his peers. He has published many books, including works on James Joyce, William Kennedy, and others, including, of course, Oscar Wilde. In our class this semester, we have been using his Norton critical edition of Picture of Dorian Gray. And just recently, he has published another Norton critical edition on the importance of being earnest. And just to give you a sense of the breadth of Michael's scholarship, he is currently working on the novels of Agatha Christie and writing about those in a postmodern landscape. I would also like to point out that Michael is a Vietnam veteran, and veterans, of course, are always welcome here on our campus, and we have a veterans center here. And there are his accomplishments. So I just want us all to give a nice St. Louis welcome, a nice UMSA welcome to Professor Michael Patrick Gillespie to speak on Wilde and Earnest.
Thank you very much, Eamon, for that very generous introduction. I'm going to read the lecture sitting down here so I can stay in focus in the camera, but also because I'm old and I get tired standing up. By the end of the lecture, you may wish that I also got tired talking, but I'll leave that until the end for you to decide. On January 5th, on January 5th, 1955 in Paris, the world premiere of Samuel Beckett's play, En attendant que Dieu, took place at the Théâtre du Babylone, As it opened, one of its central characters, Estragon, looked out into the audience and offered a terse but accurate summation of the postmodern mentality. Nothing to be done. Of course, he didn't say it in English, but I won't try your patience by inflicting upon you my badly accented French in an attempt to get the quote right. 40 years earlier, James Joyce ended his novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, with Stephen Dedalus announcing his intention to leave Ireland with a pledge that captures a central modernist tenet, the self-confident belief in the power of the individual imagination. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. However, more significantly in my view, a generation before Joyce and 2 generations before Beckett, Oscar Wilde, in chapter 3 of The Picture of Dorian Gray, has Lord Henry Wotton outline a liberating way of seeing the world that would influence literature throughout the 20th century, when he tells Dorian that the only way to overcome a temptation is to yield to it. In its volatility and unexpectedness, the phrase exemplifies an aggressive attitude towards conventional wisdom that has become the hallmark of modern writing. More specifically, however, It reveals all one needs to know about Oscar Wilde's aesthetics. Lord Henry's advice to Dorian perfectly captures both Wilde's carefully crafted public persona and his complex, sometimes contradictory approach to art. A closer look at the passage illustrates my point. Wilde begins this statement with this promise to be, with what promises to be an introduction to fairly well-known thinking about proper behavior. However, in a few words, Harry turns our expectation on its head, advocating a response to temptation antithetical to conventional behavior. At the same time, he avoids imposing a prescriptive sense on the passage by doing more than inverting its meaning. Lord Henry's words present a degree of ambivalence surrounding avoid, temptation, and yield. One can ask, is he saying that once one yields to temptation, one will never be tempted by it again? Or is he saying that in yielding to temptation, one normalizes it into what is considered regular behavior, so it's never a temptation again? Or is he saying something else entirely? With that dexterous turn of phrase, Wilde suggests that neither he nor Lord Henry meant to convey a specific prescriptive meaning, but rather he intended to engage the reader in a range of possibilities. The line is typical of the way that Wilde composed between 1890 and 1895, his most prolific and successful creative period. But it more broadly reflects an imaginative perspective that shapes Wilde's artistic impulse long before he earned any recognition in writing. Before Oscar Wilde, before he became an artist, Oscar Wilde was a brand. That is to say, for many years, like the Kardashians, but without the spandex, Oscar Wilde was simply known for being known. While that pithy description neatly captures the essence of the Wilde brand, it has connotations of inertia that can give one a deceptive sense of what it entails. Wilde achieved celebrity not through passivity or stasis. Rather, he gained and maintained renown through performance. In the way he dressed, the gestures he used, the tones he adopted, and of course, in what he actually said, Oscar Wilde always actively courted and ultimately delighted his audience. In the process of doing this, Wilde was employing a range of outlandish behavior with self-conscious calculation regarding the way others would come to see him. He vigorously attracted attention to himself in a manner designed to startle, even shock, yet at the same time, he always stopped just short of giving offense. His extravagant wit paid listeners the compliment that they had the sophistication to appreciate his performances while promising never to go so far as to try their tolerance. He succeeded at this so well that from early in his life, people would recognize him simply for being Oscar. In a curtain speech that Wilde gave after the 1892 premiere of Lady Windermere's Fan, and there's a wonderful example of his ability to startle while stopping short of exciting distaste. It mimicked a typical convention in the Victorian theater in which, after the first night's performance of a play, the author was summoned by acclamation on stage and expected to congratulate the performers while accepting the applause of the audience. Accordingly, Wilde was duly called upon to make a few remarks, but from the start, he signaled that he would be less restricted by his behavior than convention prescribed. He approached the stage with a cigarette in his hand, a mild violation of the expected protocol, and then proceeded to critique both the actors and the audience by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have enjoyed the evening immensely. The actors have given us a charming rendition of a delightful play, and your appreciation has been most intelligent. I congratulate you on the success of your performance, which persuades me that you think almost as much of the play as I do myself." Wilde's witty presentation is a perfect example of the behavior of a public persona that had been evolving for decades. Wilde begins with a slight variation on the expected form, talking to the audience about his response to the evening's entertainment. After extending the obligatory compliment for the actors, he adds a laudatory appraisal of the audience's behavior, and he ends up in a nonchalant tone that is equivalent to a verbal wink, suggesting to his listeners that they are in on the joke as much as he is. In and of itself, conduct of this sort did not establish Wilde as a great author. Nonetheless, the mercurial disposition that it conveys captures the offhand wit and the casual demeanor that unquestionably came to shape the way he wrote, suggesting that a clear sense of how he employed it should inform the way we undertake to understand his works. Having said all that, I think it important to keep in mind that despite his fondness for elaboration and the great pleasure he took in his performances, Wilde always had a clear sense of the difference between the acclaim that surrounded him and the achievement that distinguished his art. He was so confident in his awareness of that distinction that late in the picture of Dorian Gray, he seemed to indulge in a bit of self-parody of the branding process. In chapter 19, in the midst of a very serious discussion between Lord Henry and Dorian Gray about identity, Wilde has Lord Henry say to his friend, "I'm so glad that you've never done anything, never carved a statue, never painted a picture or produced anything outside of yourself. Life has been your art. You have set yourself to music. Your days are your sonnets." There's a wonderful sense of exuberance in the language that Lord Henry uses, and it perfectly matches the tendency towards hyperbole that infuses everything that he says. Significantly, that exaggerated tone can serve as a sign of caution as well as a celebration of self-indulgence. While one can certainly simply luxuriate in what Lord Henry says, its implications push the lines towards ridiculousness. They invite us to consider his perspective ironically, and in consequence, suggest a diminution of the significance of his words. At the same time, the activity, or perhaps more precisely, the inactivity that Lord Henry describes perfectly matches the public persona of Oscar Wilde, who for so long eschewed serious writing and had instead turned his conversation into epigrams and his life into performance. Whether to take the passage as a serious self-criticism or yet another example of frivolous self-celebration remains a decision left to the individual reader. What stands to me as more significant about the passage is the courage displayed in such a public revelation of the relationship that Wilde made between his brand and his art. While he never confused fame with accomplishment, Wilde certainly knew that in either case, there were a variety of ways by which he and his actions could be understood. The key to the success of his performances, of his performative approach to life and to his art, was that despite the embrace of frivolousness, Wilde layered all that he did with images inviting one to see a range of possible meanings. He never prescribed how he should be understood, but he was in fact actually sensitive to the disparity between his own perceptions and his perceptions of himself and his actions. Responding to a letter from an admirer of the picture of Dorian Gray, who asked if Wilde had modeled the title character on himself, Wilde shows his awareness of the multiple identities that could be projected on him. Basil Hallward is who I think I am. Lord Henry is who I would like to be. Dorian Gray. I'm sorry, Lord Henry is what others see me. Well, that spoiled the punchline. Lord Henry is how others see me, but Dorian Gray is whom I would like to be in another life, perhaps. Let's see if that sharpens my performance. The deftness of Wilde's language, combined with his recognition of its oscillating character, makes it all the more essential to understand its organizing principles. But that requires as much care as Wilde exercised in creating it himself. The idea of explaining him simply as a lover of paradox has become a cliched viewed in which the inversion of expected language produces a humorous response. In fact, polarities are too confining, too reductive to capture the essence of Wilde's wit. I think it more accurate to say that he reveled in ambiguity. To illustrate what I mean, let me parse another popular Wilde quotation. There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it. The inversion of the sentence order can give the impression of using paradox to make a point. In fact, Wilde plays on that simple either-or choice to create ambiguity and to open the remark to multiple interpretations. By making either consequence a tragedy, he seemingly creates mutually exclusive conditions that push one towards the sense that life is doomed no matter what one does, or that aspirations are always dangerous, or perhaps that we never really know what will satisfy us. Wilde leaves the interpretation to us. As with all of his witticisms, Wilde does not concern himself with making a pronouncement, but rather works to undermine certitude, no matter what the perspective. The inclination towards using incongruities to disrupt certainty shaped Wilde from his earliest life onward. He grew up in a family grounded on ambivalent attitudes. His mother and father stood out as Dublin eccentrics in a city distinguished by the idiosyncratic behavior of its citizens. There are numerous anecdotes illustrating this in these inclinations. Let one example suffice here. For all of her life, Jane L.G. Wilde was an ardent nationalist who wrote anti-British poems published in The Nation in the 1840s using the pen name Speranza to avoid prosecution by the English. Dr. William Wilde, in addition to being an internationally respected oculist, was a well-known Irish antiquarian. He and his wife would often spend summers touring the west of Ireland, speaking to the locals, collecting data, and doing more formal research. As a result, they published several well-received books on Irish antiquity. Nonetheless, when Queen Victoria gave him a knighthood and he became Sir William in 1864, both he and his wife were delighted to receive the English title, and they luxuriated in it for the remainder of their lives. Similar social fluctuation characterized Wilde's formative years. Throughout his formal education, he was simultaneously singled out in Irish society and insulated from it. Wilde attended the prestigious Portora Royal School in Enniskillen, and then went on to Trinity College, Dublin, as did Samuel Beckett 50 years later. The elite standings of both schools put him at the center of the Irish Protestant intellectual community. But at the same time, their Anglo-Irish ethos kept him separate from the mainstream of Irish life. In a parallel fashion, James Joyce followed a similar pattern of schooling from the Catholic perspective. He attended elite Jesuit schools, Clongowes Woods College, Belvedere College, and University College Dublin. And he finished his education in a position both at the peak of intellectual achievement and similarly cut off from the world of most of his fellow Irish. Joyce and Samuel Beckett after him found Dublin claustrophobic and provincial. Within a few years after his graduation from University College Dublin, he set off for the continent, like Stephen Dedalus, to forge a separate identity. Oscar Wilde, on the other hand, knew precisely who he was, and he went to England seeking to become part of society. If that sounds shallow, remember what Lady Bracknell says in Wilde's trivial play for serious people. Never speak disrespectfully of society, Algernon. Only people who can't get into it do that. Wilde's first step towards assimilation was to go to study at Oxford, at Magdalen College, spelled Magdalen, pronounced Magdalen by the English, but these are the same people who say aluminium and privacy, so we have to make allowances. At Magdalen College, he arrived as an outsider. He showed a tendency toward checked suits. But you won't see him in a check suit for a moment.
Oh.
There he is. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
He showed a tendency to check suits, loud check suits. He was a scholarship boy, suggesting to some of his classmates that if he couldn't pay his own way through Oxford, he didn't belong there. He possessed a clearly recognizable Irish accent, pushing him further to the margins. And he unabashedly put himself forward as a flamboyant aesthetic, being quoted in one of the college magazines as saying, "I do hope to live up to my blue china." Always the snob, able to deal with other snobs, he gloried in the attention he garnered. And he knew quite well how to handle, he knew quite well how to handle those who resented him. when 4 school bullies decided to teach him a lesson, planning to invade his rooms, to beat him up and break up his furniture, Wilde met them at the top of the staircase. He knocked down each of the first 3 and lifted the 4th one over his head and held him there until the terrified young man begged for mercy. Then Wilde turned to the crowd that had gathered, invited them into his rooms, and entertained everyone with whiskey and sherry. Needless to say, in short order, Wilde became immensely popular with classmates and continued to be so throughout his time at Oxford. Wilde also demonstrated that he was worthy of the scholarship he had received. He was an extremely successful student who made a name for himself as a rebel, cultivating a reputation of succeeding without putting any effort, despite, in fact, working hard when he had to. When he was given an oral examination to test his fluency in classical language, the Dons presented him with a version of Christ's Passion in Greek. After a short time, the examining official told Wilde he could stop because the young man had satisfied his requirement of the examination as he translated these passages into English. Wilde paid no attention, but kept on translating the Passion aloud. A second Don told Wilde that he'd passed the examination and that there was no need to continue. Wilde again ignored the instructions and went on with his oral translation. Finally, a third Don ordered him to stop. Wilde looked up from the text quite distressed and begged to be allowed to continue, saying, "I want to see how it ends." Wilde was the first Magdalen undergraduate in 50 years to win the prestigious Newdigate Prize for Poetry. At the awards ceremony, where the winning submissions were typically read, Wilde recited his poem Ravenna from memory. The undergraduates in attendance were delighted. After achieving a rare double first in his BA of Classical Moderations and Literary Humaniores, commonly known as Greats, at the end of his Oxford career, he reveled in the honor, writing to a close friend, "The dawns are a stony. Bad boy does well in the end." Yet, as academics often do, they had their revenge. A few months later, when Wilde applied for a fellowship to enable him to continue his studies at Oxford, they summarily denied the application. Oxford's loss became London's gain. Wilde moved there around 1878, the date being difficult to fix precisely because he went back and forth between Oxford and London for a period of several months. Nonetheless, once he settled in town, he became a near instant celebrity. At Oxford, he gained a measure of renown by courting well-known scholars like John Ruskin and Walter Pater. In London, he turned to actresses. He brought flowers to Sarah Bernhardt and advised her on the mores of English society. He pursued Lily Langtry with equal relentlessness. In fact, at one point, her husband, Edward Langtry, returned home late one night and found Wilde sleeping on the doorstep. When Wilde was awakened, he claimed that he was compelled to do so, for that he could he was compelled to do so, for he could not end his evening without seeing Lily one last time. Wilde's wit and nerve got him into society, and his performative disposition kept him there. His behavior continued to be as outlandish as it was in Oxford. But as at the university, he always knew just how far he could go. And his monumental self-confidence was a shield against sneering. There was, of course, an abundance of sneering. In the public's eye, Wilde's flamboyance made him an embodiment of the art for art's sake movement. And those offended by his aesthetic exuberance considered him an easy target for ridicule. He was caricatured in Punch by George du Maurier as Maud, a delicate young man in an aesthetic swoon. And Edward Linley Sanborn depicted him in the same publication as a sunflower. He was parodied as the fleshy aesthetic Bunthorne in Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta Patience, and seen by some as a figure easily dismissed for lack of seriousness. None of this bothered Wilde in the least. Quite the contrary, he gloried in the attention. When the impresario, Richard D'Oyly Carte, asked Wilde to do a brief tour of the American East Coast as a publicity stunt to promote the touring company version of Patience, Wilde readily agreed. He arrived in New York on January 3rd, 1882, and a customs agent asked him if he had anything to declare, to which Wilde responded, "Only my genius." When waiting reporters inquired how he liked the voyage, he languidly told them that he was disappointed by the Atlantic Ocean. However, he had no intention of being disappointed by America or of disappointing our country, for that matter. Before Wilde left London, he ordered a tailor to make him a suit with knee breeches and silk stockings, and he topped the ensemble off with a fur coat. There's the fur coat, and the next slide is Wilde with his knee breeches and silk stockings. These became his lecture costumes. In New York, he had pictures taken of those clothes by Napoleon Cerrone, one of the most famous photographers in America. From them, he had cards made that were sold in stores in cities where he lectured. This was a common practice for entertainers, and people collected them in much the same way they do baseball cards today. Both the cards and Wilde were soon much in demand. His talks were a tremendous success. The original schedule of a few weeks was rapidly extended to months, and finally culminated in a year-long tour of 150 cities, with the connection with Punch long forgotten. He wasn't just a pretty face. He had a keen eye for pleasing the public. He went to Boston, to New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, getting rave reviews everywhere. He ventures as far south as New Orleans, went to the Midwest, visiting Chicago, Milwaukee, even Racine, Wisconsin. Came to St. Louis on February 25th, 1882, to speak at the Mercantile Library Hall. And the next day, he toured the Shaw Botanical Gardens. From there, Wilde went west. I had to practice that alliteration a number of times to get it out. After a lecture in Leadville, Colorado at the Tabor Opera House, he drank whiskey with miners who gave him a dinner at the bottom of a silver mine. He went to west to California and learned that Mark Twain was right in saying, that the coldest winter of his life was a summer he spent in San Francisco. Excuse me. After a triumphant return across the country, he sailed for England with his brand greatly enhanced and his bank statement in a pleasant state of surplus. Although over the course of his life, he made a number of witty criticisms of America and Americans, he clearly enjoyed his visit as much as we enjoyed having him here. Back in London, Wilde's life and brand entered a new phase. He had previously proposed marriage to Florence Balcombe, a beautiful young woman whom he met at Oxford. She turned him down and married Bram Stoker instead, the author of Dracula. Undeterred, in 1884, Wilde married Constance Lloyd, with whom he had 2 children. By all accounts, he was devoted to his family and genuinely respected his wife, whose ideas featured in opinion columns when he edited Woman's World from 1887 to 1890. Sometime in the late 1880s, Wilde began taking gay lovers, beginning with Robbie Ross, a young man who became a lifelong friend. As he became more artistically and financially successful, he lived a more flamboyant life, excuse me, dining at the Cafe Royale with telegraph boys to whom he gave cigarette cases. He called this life feasting with panthers. Wilde's creative successes rapidly accumulated, and it may well have contributed to a feeling of invincibility. He published The Picture of Dorian Gray in novella form in Lippincott's magazine in 1890. And the next year, he brought out an expanded version published by Ward Lock and Company. Over the next few years, he wrote 4 highly successful West End plays. Lady Windermere's Fan in 1892, A Woman of No Importance in 1893, An Ideal Husband in 1894, and of course, The Picture of Dorian Gray. I'm sorry, The Importance of Being Earnest. I wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray in the goddamn lecture. I don't know what. I think my mind took a vacation in Bermuda when I was typing that sentence. The Importance of Being Earnest in 1895. The first 3 were melodramas punctuated by wit. The last was a searing comedy that has never gone out of repertory performance. During this period, Wilde also wrote a closet drama in French, Salome, of which perhaps the less said better. Throughout the first half of the 1890s, the success of his fiction and dramas gained Wilde increasing respect for his artistic ability, as well as earning him a good deal of money, quickly squandered. Throughout it all, he always gave the impression of spontaneity, when in fact, Wilde worked very hard on his writing, often using hotel rooms or visits to country houses for quiet places to compose. At the same time, throughout this highly productive period, he never wavered from his public persona. Wilde's personal life went through an irrevocable change after he began a love affair with Lord Alfred Douglas, Bosie, in 1895. In 1891. It became the defining experience of his life. Bosie was the second son of the Marquis of Queensberry, the man who invented the rules for prize fighting, helped develop or helped popularize cycling in England, and was the last in a long line of insane aristocrats who held that title. Bosie and his father hated one another. When the Marquis learned of his son's relationship with Wilde, Queensberry was outraged. He went to confront Wilde at Wilde's club, and when he did not find him there, he left a card inscribed to Oscar Wilde, posing as a Sodomite, leaving written proof that the British aristocracy of the 1890s valued education no more than do the British aristocrats of the 21st century. Bosie saw this as an opportunity to strike out at his father and badgered Wilde to bring a libel suit against Queensberry. Though reluctant to do so, Wilde eventually agreed, as he always did, to any of Bosie's demands. And in the spring of 1895, the case came to trial. Bosie took no part in any of the proceedings, and in fact, his name was never publicly mentioned. Wilde, on the other hand, stood at the center of the action, and he saw this as yet another opportunity for performance. Transcripts of the trial show that he was indeed quite witty in his responses to the questions put to him, though unfortunately, that miscalculated the seriousness of the situation. The leading attorney for Queensberry's defense was Edward Carson, a rival of Wilde's when they were at Trinity College, and a man who 20 years later would urge Protestant paramilitaries to use physical force in the north of Ireland to oppose British plans for home rule. For the present, however, he was content to assume the role of defender of public values. To aid in the process, Queensberry had hired private detectives to scour London to find male prostitutes who would testify against Wilde. The young men were often given the choice of doing so or going to prison. And to the credit of some, though by no means all, a number chose incarceration rather than testifying against Wilde. In the end, however, despite Wilde's amusing banter, the British justice system, notorious for its lack of a sense of humor, dismissed his wit and threw out the case. Prosecution of Wilde for immoral acts immediately followed. Any sexual contact between men in 1895 was a criminal offense. Sexual contact between women was not a criminal offense because the British conceived that as an impossibility, so there was no need to create laws for it. The first trial ended in a hung jury, but the second produced a conviction and resulted in a sentence of 2 years in prison at hard labor. These 3 successive trials banished all ambiguity about Wilde's sexuality, at least in the minds of the British public, and they profoundly undermined his art. After his arrest, Wilde's world was turned on its head. Wilde's West End plays abruptly closed. His printed books disappeared from libraries and bookstores, and his house was ransacked by rapacious creditors after he was declared a bankrupt. All this, while shocking, is hardly surprising. For the public, it did not matter whether or not Wilde believed in new hedonism. Arguably, his sexual orientation didn't matter as long as he kept it to himself. It only mattered that public events had moved opinion of him from ambiguity to certainty. Indeed, it seems fair to say, for the next 2 years, Oscar Wilde ceased to exist. He became instead prisoner 4099. Hard labor caused Wilde tremendous suffering. A fall damaged his hearing. Confinement shattered him emotionally. And the disappearance of ambiguity crippled his writing. Over his years of incarceration, he produced only 2 works. De Profundis is a long, rambling prison letter ostensibly written to Lord Alfred Douglas. It's full of self-pity and almost completely devoid of wit. Wilde also composed the Ballad of Reading Jail, a poem still widely anthologized in high school textbooks. Bless you. Still widely anthologized in high school textbooks and probably responsible for many students never again looking at a piece of verse. Without his brand as a lodestar, Wilde simply could not create as he had before. Certitude defeated ambiguity and stifled his art. After his release from prison, Wilde went to live in the continent, depending on the charity of friends for support. For the next 3 years, he led a peripatetic life, and he died in Paris in a cheap hotel on the 30th of November, 1900, a few months before Queen Victoria. His reported last words were, "Either the wallpaper goes or I do." Although the ascription may be apocryphal, it offers a sense of consolation, real or not, that at least a measure of his brand had returned in his final days. No matter what his material circumstances, to the end of his life, Oscar Wilde never wavered in his belief in the importance of entertainment as a key feature in art, and never stopped trusting the reader's ability to engage what he had written. As he says in the preface to, at one point, in the preface to the Picture of Dorian Gray, no artist desires to prove anything. Even things that are true can be proven. I've come to believe that a full understanding of Oscar Wilde's writing and of its impact on major 20th century authors like James Joyce and Samuel Beckett can come only after one has acquired a clear sense of his brand. I hope that my talk today has disposed you to feel the same, but whether it has or not, thank you for your attention and for the privilege of speaking here this afternoon. Well, Professor Wall, that if there was some time after, I guess there is some time, that I'll read the opening of the importance of being earnest and try to point to a few ways in which Wilde uses the essence of his brand to create his art. And then after that, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer. The play opens with Algernon Moncrief on stage playing the piano, and off stage his manservant Lane. As Lane comes in, Algernon says, "Did you hear what I was playing, Lane?" "I didn't think it polite to listen, sir." "I'm sorry for that, for your sake. I don't play accurately. Anyone can play accurately. And I play with wonderful expression. As far as the piano is concerned, sentiment is my forte. I keep science for life." "Yes, sir." "Oh, by the way, Lane, I see from your book that on Thursday night, when Lord Shoreham and Mr. Worthing were dining with me, 8 bottles of champagne are entered as having been consumed." "Yes, sir. 8 bottles and a pint." Why is it at a bachelor's establishment that the servants invariably drink the champagne? I ask merely for information. I attribute it to the superior quality of the wine, sir. I have often observed that in married households, the champagne is rarely of a first-rate brand. Good heavens, is marriage as demoralizing as that? I believe it is a very pleasant state, sir. I've had very little experience of it myself up to the present. I've only been married once. That was in consequence of a misunderstanding between myself and a young person. I don't know that I'm much interested in your married life, in your family life, Lane. No, sir, it's not a very interesting subject. I never think of it myself. At the beginning of the play, Wilde is showing us the performative nature of the characters, not simply that they're acting, but they are performing for one another. They are playing back and forth. But he's showing, to my mind, a number of other things as well. One of the undertones that runs through this opening scene is the difference in class. Lane is a servant. Lane is someone employed by Algernon. Lane is someone who goddamn well better know his place, who can only respond according to certain protocols and certainly would never challenge his master. Wilde also shows us that even if you are Lane, even if you are in a situation where you have to be very careful with what you say, that when you are clever, when you are witty, when you know how to use language, you can always get the best of a stupid aristocrat. Algernon gives himself away in the opening, in his opening remarks, when first he demands attention, seeing himself as the center of it. And then when Lane deflects the remarks, he's already showing a measure of independence. When Lane deflects the remarks, Algie tries to pass it off. Wayne, I didn't think it polite to listen. That's too bad because I don't play well, but I play with a great deal of emotion. Sentiment is my forte, making a bad pun on the piano forte, a kind of grand piano. Lane just lets this go by the board, and when he doesn't rise to the bait, when he doesn't rise to the bait, Algernon determines that he's going to continue to use him, to play with him, to make Lane a sounding board for his wit. And so he begins by introducing the idea of consumption of alcohol. Where did all those champagne bottles go? I know that they 8 bottles have been consumed. Immediately, Lane comes back and says, 8 bottles and a pint. Algie won't let go because he is determined, after all, he's the one who pays Lane's salary. He's determined to get the last word. And so he shifts the subject. Why is it in a bachelor's household that the servants invariably drink all the champagne? And Lane is up to it again. He can't say, it's not us, you drunken son of a bitch. You were the ones that did it. But instead, he says, I attribute it to the quality of the champagne, which is much higher than in married households. When Lane is taking control of the conversation, turning it in the direction that he wants it to go. Algie isn't quick on his feet the way Lane is. And so all he can say is, oh my God, is married life as bad as all of that? Which is the opening that Lane wanted, in which he says, I don't know. I've had very little experience. I've only been married once, and that was because of a misunderstanding with a young person. there aren't many misunderstandings you can have that lead to marriage, but he's making the point quite clearly. And Algernon, by this time, is on the verge of giving up and wants to remind Lane who it is that pays his salary every Friday evening. I don't think I'm much interested in your family life. There, the conversation is over. No, it's not, because Lane comes back and says, you're quite right. I never think of it myself. And it prepares us for seeing the way characters are going to go back and forth, for judging their wit, for judging the wit of the play, even when the characters themselves might not be aware of it. And it's Wilde's ability to use this nonchalant exuberance to trust his audience to get the joke, even when the characters don't. If you have any questions, you would like to raise them, I'd be glad to, at the very least, make up an answer.
And the questions and your comments will be on YouTube forever, you know. So if you want to ask a question and immortalize yourself, please ask Professor Gillespie. Please raise your hand and ask him a question.
Yes, Charlie.
I'm wondering if there's any connection. The American writer at the same time that comes to mind as having done pretty much the same thing as Mark Twain, the performance and the as reinforcing the written word and so on, and making a career out of it. Did they connect at all? Does Twain ever say anything about whatever his name is, Wilde, or vice versa, or did they meet during the trip? Or?
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah.
I was trying to finesse that with the remark about San Francisco, and not admit that they hadn't run into each other. He did go and visit Walt Whitman, and was very respectful of Whitman's craft and of Whitman as an individual. There's that long tradition of artist as entertainer. Dickens would do that all the time, would lecture. And in fact, when Wilde came back from America after this year-long tour, he went on a series of short lecture tours in England, where he talked about how foolish and eccentric Americans were, and got a lot of capital out of that. But I don't know that he had, aside from Whitman, I don't know that he had much contact with other American writers.
I do have a question on Zoom for you. When he went out west, what were the topics of his talks?
The same ones as they were when he was in the East. He had two lectures. One was on a general lecture on aesthetics, and the other was on House Beautiful. And he had them down pat and would decide as he walked on stage, getting a measure of the audience, this is what I'm going to talk about tonight, and try to fit the talk as best he could to the audience in front of him. But he just used those two the whole year long and never got bored with them because he was intoxicated by the sound of his own voice.
Person wants to know if you can stay with us just one more hour.
I'd like to preserve that and show it to my students when they teach next Monday night. Yes.
I'd like to know which of Joyce's works did Wilde influence, at what point, and how did he influence them?
I think he read Dorian Gray. He had Dorian Gray in his library, and I would be surprised. I don't know with certitude that he read The Importance of Being Earnest, but I'd be surprised if he had not. Actually, there was a performance of The Importance of Being Earnest in Zurich, put on by during World War I. Joyce and his family had to leave Trieste, which was under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He had a British passport. He was an enemy alien. He had to leave Trieste in 1915, and he stayed in Zurich until 1919. There were a group of British expatriates there that formed the English Players, and they put on the importance of being earnest. He also, I mean, he was very much aware of Wilde, aware of the injustice that was done to Wilde, aware of the facility, the way Wilde could work with language and make it do anything that he wanted to. Early in Ulysses, in the first chapter, the Telemachus chapter, takes place in something called a Martello Tower, which is a tower that the English built during the Napoleonic Wars along the Irish coast, the defense for defensive purposes in case the French ever invaded. And by that time, 1904, it was being rented out to people. And in fact, Joyce and Oliver St. John, I pronounced it St. John Gregory, lived in one of these Martello towers. Joyce converted that experience into the opening chapter of Ulysses, where Stephen Dedalus and Buck Mulligan are there having breakfast in the Martello Tower. And Mulligan is a very exuberant character, very hyperbolic in everything that he says or does. Stephen is just waking up, and he's crabby and not interested. He's heard all these one-liners that Mulligan has used time and again, and so yeah, fine. At one point, Mulligan is shaving, and he picks up a hand mirror, and he said, I pinched it out of the skivvy's room. And Stephen looks at it and says, the cracked hand mirror of the servant. And Mulligan says, that's a great line. You got to use that. He had previously said, Mulligan had previously talked about getting dressed and wanting to do the Wilde touch, have that extravagant behavior. The line that Stephen is using, cracked looking glass of a servant, is right out of Oscar Wilde's collection of essays and intentions. Stephen knows the joke. Mulligan doesn't. And Joyce is using that as a way of defining Stephen's personality. He's not going to challenge Mulligan directly, either because he's too tired or because Mulligan is paying the rent on the Martello Tower. But he's having that inside joke that allows him to play on that. So there was a connection with Wilde that ran through Joyce's writing. And in Finnegan's Wake, there's some references to it too. Yes.
What happened to Wilde's relationship with Bosie? He wrote the letter to him from prison.
He did. Bosie claimed he never received it. They saw one another a few times when Wilde was on the continent. And it never really, I think Wilde still felt affection for him, but the relationship never redeveloped as it had been. Bosie became a very conservative Catholic and denied ever having any kind of physical relationship with Oscar Wilde, and turned out to be just as crazy as his father.
Which I feel like my question's maybe a little bit, I guess is more geared towards the sort of historical or political reality of the time, but just that you mentioned there was a sort of the commonality between Joyce, Beckett, and Wilde all leaving Ireland in this sort of diaspora. And I just was wondering if you could maybe comment on that and sort of they, them saying it's this sort of stifling nature of being in Ireland and sort of maybe what the intellectual culture was there at the time.
Yeah. Well, this was at the time when the Irish literary revival was just beginning, and Lady Augusta Gregory had her thumb on everything with Yeats and George Moore and even the dyspeptic George Bernard Shaw would go out to Cool Park and have a kind of summer away from Dublin. But it was very clear, particularly when they began to form the Irish National Theatre, the kind of writing that was going to be approved and the kind that was going to be suppressed. If you wanted to write about Irish antiquity, if you wanted to write about Cuchulainn, or if you wanted to write about noble peasants, that was fine. But if you wanted to write about lower middle class urban Catholics, forget about it. And Joyce knew that, and as did Beckett, and so he had to leave. I had a taste of it myself, and I think Professor Wilde could tell you much better, would know about this much better, but than I would. But one summer I was working at the Irish Film Center, just off Dame Street. I was doing a book on Irish film, and I would go there every day and watch film. But I got very close to the staff. They really were nice people. And one day we were going out to have lunch, and we just had walked out the door, and I started talking, the big American voice that we all develop when we're overseas. And I said, I was watching television last night at the B&B, and there was a movie that had Sharon Stone in it. And I thought to myself, how does this woman possibly, she's so terrible. How does she keep getting parts in film after film? And I said, I'm sorry for the Sharon Stone fans that I just offended. It's too bad. I said, but it just amazes me that she can keep getting work. Who in Ireland is like that? Absolutely no talent, but continually getting work in films. And both of them went dead silent for a moment. And then they looked over their shoulder, and it was only then that I realized this is a pretty small world, a small community, and you better be damn well careful what you say, because you never know who is going to hear it. That's the kind of world, and I'm sure you've got much better anecdotes than that don't involve slandering Sharon Stone.
Of course, I'm not going to slander Sharon Stone, but I was very interested at the beginning of your talk of the comparison of Oscar Wilde and the Kardashians. That the idea of not what you're produce, but you be the image of yourself, what you project. And it just reminded me of, in some ways, of how relevant Wilde is. How Wilde helps us in some ways understand our own culture. So I'm not going to insult Sharon Stone. I don't know enough anyway. But I think you have a question from the.
All right.
Yeah, long one up there.
Yeah.
Said you're clever and witty, and we agree that Oscar Wilde possessed the skill of Algernon to make language do whatever he wants it to. As his creative energy, cleverness, violence, whatever romantic energies that appear. In other words, does Wit reduce or limit the ability of the artist to approach seriousness?
Well, I don't understand the question, so I'll answer it any way I want to. The reason I was so dismissive about Salome, it is this closet drama that focuses on Salome and the dance of the seven veils and the determination that she has to seek vengeance on John the Baptist by having her stepfather Herod cut his head off. But it's done in such wooden, with such wooden dialogue and constricted action. It's like watching a Yeats play. Particularly since I don't think you have to be flippant to write good drama. But I think you have to have a certain intelligence, a certain wit, a certain resonance with the audience. And the best drama, the best literature has that. That's what I think makes Dorian Gray so powerful, is that it's so detached from us. This wealthy young man who can get away with anything, yet the way Wilde represents him and Lord Henry and Basil Hallward and Sybil Vane and other characters throughout resonates with the way human beings act in 2022 in St. Louis, Missouri, or anywhere else. The certain fundamental attitudes are there, and so we can see that back and forth. But there was a stiffness, as I read Salome, there's a stiffness in it that just never connects with an audience. So that's the reason that I have such disdain for it.
We maybe have time for one more question. Anybody want to ask a question? Okay, well, what we will do then is we will stop there. I'm so grateful to everybody for coming along today and for allowing us to resume our events here live. And it's been a real pleasure and an honor to have Professor Gillespie come and to speak on Oscar Wilde, and a wonderful lecture. So I also want to mention our audience out there in the webinar. There's many more people out there, and so I thank you as well. So you go ahead. You want to say?
I was just going to say, I want to thank you for your attention this afternoon, and it's persuaded me that you enjoyed the talk almost as much as I did.
I'm going to leave that. So thank you so much. Thank you. Anybody wants to wait behind and have a private chat with Professor Gillespie, you're welcome to do so. Or if you brought any of your Norton books that you wanted to sign them for you,